this idea that organisms are adapting to specific food source. Now, as Darwin was on this 5-year mission, he had a long time to actually do some reading. And one of the really cool things that he was reading was by a work by a gentleman named Thomas Malthus. Malthus was actually an economist. And so he was actually reading about economics. And you're wondering, when you think about why do we have to learn these other fields? Maybe I'm not going to be a biologist. Why do I need to learn biology? Well, it actually may become beneficial, just like this work was critical to Darwin. And what Malthus was proposing as an economics is he was concerned about what was occurring in Europe at the time. As he saw this, the food resource had this linear growth habit. So is this linear growth of food production. And what we're seeing is that large cities were becoming larger and larger and more populous. And so Malthus saw that you had a geometric increase in in population. And as he was exploring this, he said, well, what will happen in these large cities is eventually the population will exceed the food supply, creating this point of crisis. So what happens at that point? What happens to this population when there's not enough food? Does just everybody die out? Who dies out? Who doesn't survive? And Darwin took this, instead of thinking what's going on in a city, he's thinking what's going on in the natural world, what's going on outside, and that there is this limited food supply, but populations have this capacity for massive growth. That was what Darwin was looking at. So, and he comes up with this idea of natural selection. And when we think about what Darwin's contribution to science was, it was the idea of natural selection. It was not the idea of evolution. Darwin proposed the main driving force behind evolution, which was natural selection. Now realize he waited 15 years after he came back to publish this essay on this idea of natural selection, which we'll talk about in just a minute here. So this driving force that led to organisms to change. Now, realize that in waiting 15 years, he had some concerns there. But before we get to that, let's take a look at what is this idea of natural selection. So in natural selection, there are 3 major steps that we have to be, or conditions that have to occur. The first is you have to have variation amongst individuals in a population, and it has to have a genetic basis. Okay? So, as we look at this population of peoples here, we see that there's a lot of variation there. Okay, we see variation in hair color, we see variation in skin tones, we see variation in their shirts, types of shirts wearing. Some are wearing hats, some have glasses, and so forth. Some have button-up shirts, what have you. Now, not all of these traits, the differences we see here, is genetic. So, their choice of shirt color is probably not necessarily genetic. The choice of whether or not to wear a hat, probably not genetic. Their hairstyles, not necessarily genetic. Okay? However, some of these traits definitely are genetic. Okay? So their sex is genetic. Their height would be genetic. Skin tone, eye color, various traits that affect their behavior, all of those have genetic traits. So he said that there has to be variation amongst individuals in a population. And this could be humans, this could be guppies, this could be robins that are outside, that there are genetic variations amongst organisms in natural populations. Step 2, organisms will produce more offspring than can survive. So they're going to produce lots of offspring that have a mix of genetic traits from the parents. Okay, so we get this overproduction of offspring. And to give you an appreciation for how massive this overproduction is, let's consider E. coli. Okay, all of us have E. coli living in our digestive tract. If E. coli were allowed to grow unrestricted at its optimal growth rate, it could cover the surface of the earth in 6 days. We could produce enough E. coli to cover the surface of the earth in 6 days. Now, obviously, we're not walking in layers of E. coli on everything. There are things that prevent E. coli from exceeding its growth. But we do have this overproduction of offspring. Another example we might look at is a field mouse. Okay? A field mouse can start reproducing at 9 weeks of age and have a litter of 6 every 3 weeks. So if you start with one pregnant female, okay, you could have a total of 22,000 field mice from one pregnant female in a period of 54 weeks, roughly a year. Now again, every step we take, we're not crushing little mice below our feet, because they're all over the place. All right? Something is limiting populations. Okay. The third step is that we come into this key step, differential survival and reproduction of offspring. So some offspring don't survive. All right? And what determines whether some offspring survive or not are things we call selection pressures. So can you think about, for field mice, what are things that might prevent a baby field mouse from reaching adulthood? What are some of those selection pressures? So hopefully you're thinking about things like the ability to obtain food. Could it go out and find food? Okay. Could it avoid predators? Certainly predators will be feeding on those field mice. Could it avoid disease? So diseases will limit populations. Could it survive in the elements? Can it find protection during the winter, during those harsh periods? Could it find a mate? Okay, so not everybody necessarily will get the opportunity to reproduce. So you get differential survival and differential reproduction. Not individuals necessarily will reproduce in that population. And thus, those that have the better traits in an environment will pass their traits on to the next generation. So these are those 3 central concepts to the idea of natural selection. All right? Know these. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more, say no more. Now, as we look at this idea, we have variation amongst individuals. They then reproduce, produce large numbers of offspring, and then we get differential survival. So some individuals can't reach that food, obtain food, thus they die out. And this is how Darwin, in the idea of natural selection, would explain evolution of giraffes. Or as this student put on the test here, where the question was diagram, this diagram best illustrates. So you get the idea of these tall giraffes and the short-necked ones dies out. They proposed giraffes are heartless creatures. Nice little piece of humor there. So not the idea of natural selection though. But this would represent natural selection. So in 1859, Darwin pulls the trigger, publishes On the Origin of Species. And this is his central piece of work where he describes the idea of natural selection. Over those 15 years, he was collecting a tremendous amount of scientific evidence because he knew that putting this forth was going to go against basically all that was being taught in science and religion at that time of how organisms changed. So again, why does he wait 15 years to publish? Because he knew that humans were going to be equated to monkeys. That, as we look at this change in time, as organisms changed over time, here is a publication here. Now, this man is but a worm, okay, ridiculing the idea of evolution as proposed by Charles Darwin, that humans also evolved. So what really got Darwin to publish was this dude here, okay? Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace, somebody who really is kind of overlooked. He independently came to the same conclusions as Darwin. He did this. He was primarily in Indonesia, studying in Indonesia. He was actually collecting butterflies and beetles that he would then collect and send back to England for sales. He was not college educated as Darwin was, but he noted that as he'd go up in elevation, he would see the changes in organisms as they changed in elevation. And eventually, he came up with he wrote his ideas down. You don't need to know the title of this, but titled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Infinitely from the Original Type. And he needed somebody to review this idea that he had, that organisms change through this process, which was natural selection. He knew Darwin, 14 years ahead, had published an essay on some similar ideas, but didn't necessarily have the evidence. Alfred Russel Wallace had that evidence. Charles Darwin had the evidence, but he wasn't publishing it. So when Darwin receives this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to get beat to the publication. Everybody's going to credit Alfred Russel Wallace for this. And in fact, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace become very dear friends. Both of their manuscripts are presented to the Royal Society of London on the same night. Darwin's findings are presented first, since he had originally done the research before Russel Wallace. And as such, we recognize Darwin as being the forefather of this idea of natural selection, although Alfred Russel Wallace came up with this idea as well. Of course, keep in mind, Al-Jahiz came up with this idea 900 years earlier, just he didn't have the evidence. He didn't collect the massive amounts of evidence to support this idea. Okay? At that point, it was still philosophy. The thing that separates science is it's evidence-based and has that evidence to back it up. So that sets the stage for us to move forward. I'm sorry this was kind of a long podcast. The rest won't be so bad here. But I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll continue on taking a look at the driving forces behind evolution next time.